And with today's session, as I've mentioned, I am screen recording, but I've also made some notes which I'll be following and share with us all afterwards. So don't worry yourself about any of the details unless there's something a bit off the track or you have a question in particular you would like answering. In terms of the format, the way I'd like it to run is I'll just talk in little sections, and then I will invite you to either ask me a question or answer any questions that I would please ask you post on Slack. So this is really the first time we're having our node sharing sessions, so I don't expect it to be 100% smooth, but we've got to start somewhere. Okay, so as I said, I'll start off just talking a little bit about Docker. For those who haven't run it before, it's basically a way of, call it, virtualizing and segregating processes, and it runs the same whether we are on Windows, Linux, or Mac. And what I have on my screen at the moment is the second level of Docker, something called Docker Compose, where rather than having to write everything out on the command line itself, you can see we've got a nice simple YAML file here where we've got images defined and sort of which ports are going to be forwarded. So that's part of Docker itself. By default, everything is private to the individual container until told otherwise. So ports exposes that. In this case, the one on the left, if I go to port 82, it'll bring me Mailhog, whereas in the Mailhog image, 8025 is itself. I like to use an image which I typically call toolchain. So I have a loadout of all of the command line tools that we will use specific to that project. So in this toolchain that I built for us at Symbol, it's as you can see the PHP 7 version, but it's already got Composer, Node.js, Gulp, and a bunch of static code analysis tools such as PHP MS Detector, Copy Paste Detector, Code Beautifier, PHP Unit, and all of that sort of stuff, which is one of the other great things about Docker. Like my system itself is very clean, and I can put all of the junk into these throwaway containers. One of the other bits to note, because as I mentioned, Docker containers are all isolated. You've got volume management, which are call them, I wouldn't call them permanent, but the more long-term storage. They get basically a file system of their own, but you can also share with the host. So again, for development, this volumes declaration here uses something called Union File System. So what I've got on my Mac shows up in this image there. And one of the other parts, links, this is where, because all of the containers themselves are isolated, when we want to not just expose the ports to the wider world, but link the containers themselves, we just have a simple definition by service name. So here I've called these services like database, SQL, couch, mail server, etc. Obviously, the main logic, separate from my toolchain, is the actual app platform itself. This is really just PHP FPM, and so this doesn't have the tools that are in the toolchain. It's supposed to reflect what we would have sitting behind the web server. But you can see one of the other definitions here, volumes from, it will take whatever is in toolchains. So it leaves alone my host stuff and takes it from there. And then there's really just another one for the web server, the SQL server, couch, RabbitMQ, and I'm not sure if you like Graylog. there's a different stack called the Elk stack, which is Elasticsearch, Logger, and Kibana. Um, if you're used to using Greylog, I'll probably change it up because it's what we do use, but it's a wild one, so this saves us having to actually hunt through any Symfony logs, Nginx logs, or PHP logs. And that's really the Docker Compose in a nutshell. For everyone's convenience, I sort of made a simple shell script which does a lot of the boot up, basically just checking that you got the tools that you need. If you're on Linux, when using shared volumes, it's quite possible that you have permission problems. So this creates sort of an environment file, which in the composer said you can uncomment. And then it's really just a build. And what build does, unless we have specified otherwise, is reaches out to a repository, which by default is Docker Hub, and then looks for these images. So there's like a MySQL, and then under the MySQL, they've got the MySQL server project, and then on the end, you can have different branches. So as I say, for us, I've got a platform for PHP 5 and then some other stuff. So it makes it very easy to experiment and match whatever you are running in production. And for those who've not used Docker before, and you might be wondering, how do I use the toolchain? You can get shells into your running containers, and it's important to note these I and T tags here. I is basically making it interactive. If you don't have that, you run one command and it will appear to freeze. So aside from just simplifying what we can do with the environment, taking this approach has another benefit. So here, like when I've got volumes, taking the database SQL as an example, you can see like var lib SQL actually sits on my host. And if you want to actually make changes to the database and you don't want to have to import or roll back anything, what you can do, and what I would recommend, is actually have this data volume here pointing somewhere else on your system, and then just make that a Git repository. And at that point, you can do whatever you like with it. And it's really, so long as the volume's not running when you do your resets or commits, you are safe as houses and can continue merrily along your way. Okay, so that's our Docker in a nutshell. Just having a look. I know I'm sort of fast forwarding today because I'm going to try and cram it all in to a shorter time as possible. But does anyone have any quick questions about Docker itself, or shall I go on with the show? Remember, if you do, type them in Slack or speak out here. I'm not looking at the Hangout, just to let you know. Okay, I guess not. So when it comes to Doctrine, today's workshop's really going to be a bit of a primer. I realize a lot of you have already been using it, and a lot of what I say might sound familiar or very boring because you know it like the back of your hand. But along the way, I will be introducing what I consider some of the best practices. So let's carry on. Let's start with the simple introduction. What even is Doctrine? Put simply, it's a mature set of PHP libraries that have been around for over a decade, and the emphasis is to simplify data definition, data manipulation, and retrieving the data. Not to mention, and also mentioning the configuration. So even compared to functions built into PHP itself, such as PDO or the MySQLi, you're getting the full end-to-end tool set and a lot of extra functionality along the way. Quite often, because Doctrine has a caching component to it, we actually get better performance than native SQL when it's used properly. So just to expand on that a little bit, it's got support for a wide variety of database platforms, covering not just relational systems, but also document-driven and something called PHP content repository data stores. So for us as developers, we either choose ORM, which is the relational, or ODM, which is document. And for us, using ORM, that means we can use, SQL, MySQL, Lite, Microsoft SQL, PostgreSQL, and a couple of others. If you want more information about that, you can obviously look on their site. As I briefly mentioned, it's about configuration, and this is in scalable systems. You typically don't just work with a single database. So from within the same platform, Doctrine makes it very easy to have multiple connections up and running. Like in a high traffic environment, it's quite typical where you would have like one database for which only handles the write operations, and then sort of oh god, what's the word I'm looking for? And then it passes the data on to onto some children, which would then focus on the reading. So it helps out with that. There's really three ways of writing queries, but I'll get into that later on. So don't believe that everything you hear with Doctrine is only ever about the same thing. As what we've been using it for, it's an abstraction of the schema, where we can basically create a set of objects, and then running a simple procedure, it will actually reach out to the database and set up the schema accordingly. So we use migrations. This is just a part of it. But once normalized, we will also be adding on some of the logic on top of it. And that's really where it becomes powerful. For the application developer itself, and it's something that we haven't even touched on in our platform yet, it's got a very powerful event system which allows us to sort of put a series of hooks onto operations, whether it's like pre-persist, post-persist, and everything else that it does, and sort of separate our code in that room. So it helps us out with the logic. So given what I just said, and that's compared to like the PDO or SQLite, there's pretty much no reason we shouldn't be using a form of database abstraction in today's world. Almost everything we need has been thought about and created. It's just a matter of stringing it together. So for Symfony itself, the standard edition, and that is quite important because Symfony on its own is just a set of components, incorporates Doctrine out of the box just through another bundle and registering it in the app kernel like anything else. So there's nothing particularly special going on. What the bundle does do is act as a proxy service for many of the Doctrine functions, and has a couple of extra helpers on top. Other than that, it really doesn't do anything more. I mean, if you want details, you can look in. Let's go look in there. You can just go into the Doctrine namespace, and we can see it's actually like a very, very small bit, because like where Symfony is not just our framework, it's kind of a philosophy which follows that. So basically, most people who develop PHP components these days develop them along something called solid design principles. So that's beyond the scope of today's session, but it's really just saying making code expect you know what you're going to be working with, in other words. So just to come. Oh, hello. Yes, by all means. So, it, okay. So just to mention that what you see here, the one on the right is what is going on within the container. Yeah. So yeah. So what we let's say okay. Yeah. Just change the one on the left is what comes out on your host system. The one on the right is what is within the image. So if you want to have it differently and you want your 7.9, you would just let you do that and then restart your Docker containers and it's okay. That's all right. So as I say, to get back, really, when it comes to some of these helpers, the Doctrine bundle itself for Symfony is really just some middleware for the configuration parameters because the Symfony's got its own way of laying out config in, and it's about more than YAML, but there's our space for that. We've got some debug helpers which help explain and dump the queries to the front end or the command line. And probably the bigger part is that there's a whole suite of Symfony commands to allow us to manage the database from the command line, which is where pretty much we would do it. So, okay, so now we'll get on and be a bit more practical, but rather than creating a DB from scratch, I would like to. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback from someone. Okay. Okay. So rather than creating a database from scratch, I would like to quickly show you how it can do some reverse engineering because you might have some existing projects to there. So all we've got here, I just created a very simple schema in MySQL Workbench for a post and a category, nothing special. But right now, our database is empty. So I'll just sync that up. Don't want to sync that here these days. And in turn, you might not have configured your. Let's just slow down a moment so I can explain what's going on before I do. So I can connect to the MySQL database here because we've got our image running and we've got it exposed on the standard port. So we can, what Docker does is, in essence, maps local host to its own internal router and will pass it on to the appropriate service. So here the way this image works, if we haven't specified a different schema, it will just create a schema by the same name as our password. So in there we've got test. I see in the model itself though that it's a version behind, so you might need to just change that if you want it to be the same. I think that is a version behind, but now you can kind of go ahead and sync it, and it's just going to push them into MySQL. And if I refresh our schema, we've now got our two tables. So a bit more about the reverse engineering part, and I will leave this on the screen for a bit if you do want to follow one, whereas I'm just copying and pasting it. It's that. And is that that Doctrine itself can dive into a database and pull out some mapping. Okay. You may or not be aware that when it comes to parsing configuration and definitions, Symfony itself can handle native PHP objects, XML, YAM, and YAML. I think there's another one in there, but those are the main three. But when we put it out of the database, for the fullest definition, XML gives us the most power. Annotations are really about convenience. But by running this simple mapping import command, I don't think I'm... Let's try that again. Okay, so all it's really doing there is getting SQL to describe itself, and it's creating these, and we right now could carry on developing a Symfony app using these definitions that we have, but for us, we would prefer to have them as objects, so we can do a little bit more with it. So the next command I'm going to paste is going to convert any of these definitions that it finds in our source directory into the object entities with annotations. Yeah, so I'll just go ahead and run that. Whilst it's doing that, it's worth noting that after this command has finished running, we are actually going to have two database definitions of the same thing. I've already got them on there, as a matter of fact. So if I hadn't already run it a bit earlier before this, just to test, it would have gone out and created what you are used to seeing here. Yeah. You may notice that our getters and setters are missing, but before we do anything with that, I'm just going to remove the XML definitions because they are in conflict with each other. You can do that from the command line or from your IDE or whatever, but we need them to be distinct, or Symfony will complain. As I say, I already ran this just before, so hopefully yours will be a little bit different. And just to make sure we can carry on working with it, we're going to generate the getters and setters. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. The Symfony officially recommend, like, once you are familiar with the way the class data object classes are defined, that you do them manually. I take a slightly different way, which is along the same lines, where so we've got our getters and setters being generated there. Just wait a moment. Okay, so if we now hop back in, you see we've got our normal stuff. But so in many cases, we are going to want to add our own custom code in there, but we're going to want Doctrine to maintain the flexibility to, generate all of this stuff for us. So what I tend to do, and I would ask that we as a group start doing, is I just, after the property definitions themselves, and I've just copy and pasted that, so, but don't worry about it. I just make a simple little definition that says, start custom code, and then anything below here is auto-generated and should not be changed. So quite often we might even want to change, in this case, I'll use the sets, like the post title setter as an example. If we are going to do something funky with it, I'll just move it into that block and then do the modification. And before ever running that entity generator again, I just delete everything below that line. It's just a way to keep it clean, and it means we know where our code is, and we can sort of forget about anything else. So it makes life simpler. I've seen that in our existing system, we've got it a bit mixed up. but that again will change. So I'm not going to talk too much about the annotations themselves. What I will do is ask and this has been a document I'll share after this, so don't worry about it too much. Just get everyone to make sure you have this doctrine annotations page bookmarked. It's very useful. And the only other thing I will really say about the annotations in this session is to do with relationships. So, you know, whether it's a one-to-one, a one-to-many, a many-to-one, or a many-to-many, we will often need what in doctrine called bi-directional relationships. So using our model as an example, you know, we're going to want to be able to find out about categories from the post, and we're going to want to be able to get a list of categories from the post. So when you define this sort of relationship, you will have an owning side, and the owning side is purely to do with the way the Doctrine Watcher works. So if you make changes to something like the category or the post, well, I'll even take a step back. Let's say our post is the owning side of the category relationship, because that makes sense. Yeah? If we, through a given post entity, make a change to something in the category that it's associated with, it will be ignored. However, if whilst we've got the post, we change the category that's being used or something about the post itself, it will be watched. So you either have a mapped by or an inversed by. If I go straight to the documentation, which is again linked, I've got a link in the document I'll share after that. It's got some much clearer information that will give you much more detail than we've got time to go over today. Again, about relationships, one thing I would like to say is when it comes to many, so where you have a link in between, oops, that's the wrong one. We should not define the entities ourselves. So just to illustrate kind of the situation I'm talking about, you know, where one post can have many categories and many categories can have one post. If I go back into it requires a change in both the post and the category entity. So where we've got our category at the moment, you see it's defined as so. Now we've just defined a join table for us, and much like we got our mapped by and then inversed by, we hold that in these tables as well. So unless we actually need to have some extra properties on the many-to-many table itself, like beyond just those two indexes, we should always use this approach. And I'll just post the inverse side. So as you can see here on our join, it's about post and ID, inverse category. If I were to go into the category itself, we've not got any reference to posts because we haven't got that many to many. It's just the other way around. That's exactly the same. We've got our target entity, our join columns, and our inverse columns. But the only difference is really those two definitions. Okay. On my screen, I'm not going to go into it, but don't forget that when you sort of change these definitions, because the getters and setters themselves would be different, you would need to rerun that entity generation function. Yeah? So where we've generated our getters and setters here, after making those changes, we'd need to do them again. Okay, so that's really just a brief rundown on that. I'll just check if there's anything on this. No? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about working with entities themselves at the moment, because I see there are many things we do on our platform which I would consider a bit of abuse. Yeah, it's very simple and tempting to create and handle the saving of data objects within the controller classes themselves. But aside from just moving these functions into side services for cleanliness, it will heavily impact the maintainability of our code for a few reasons. So I've just listed like 3 of what I would consider the major ones here. If we use the entity in multiple places, and there's a point where we actually make a change to the entity definition, wherever it's used, we've got to go and modify the code in all of those places. Similarly, by using Entity Manager itself, we are locking ourselves to using a relational database system. You may remember I mentioned that we can use ORM or ODM. Furthermore, what if we want to scale up? Because I mentioned that in high traffic sites you can have different nodes for different purposes. Like you have one that takes all of the write-ups, and then you can have a whole series of slaves where they're just for writing. So when we have it coded in that one way, that makes it impossible. And one thing we might take for granted when we think about these putting like data code in our controllers itself is that we would quite frequently want to have some extra logic surrounding the operation itself. I mean, we could create an event listener, because as I said, that there is a lot of power in there, but that itself, taking that approach, would either tie us to use one of Doctrine's like pre-persist, pre-update, or any of the other stuff. So those get run on every time that type of operation is done. We would want to actually create some kind of custom event listeners. So it's important now to mention like why I've just told you these. That there is a design pattern called the facade service. So a facade is really nothing more than a proxy itself between what you're trying to do with the data and the data, or like some further manipulation. It's kind of like a helper. So I'm gonna create one on my screen in a moment, and it might seem like a duplication of effort because for the simple code we are gonna write, it is a duplication. But as I mentioned a bit earlier, those issues we can address and separation occur. So moving on, before we can do that, we are going to need a way to retrieve our data. Yeah. Now, I'm sure you know, like Doctrine already provides a series of magic repository services for every entity that we are going to operate on. So if I actually undo those a moment, just to make sure that it's all clean, and I'll just bring up a control. Oh, the one thing I have not done at this point is, because we reversed engineered it, I'm wasting my time, sorry. So it provides a series of magic repository services, giving us methods like find, which is where you get a single record by its primary key. You also got some like common criteria such as find by, and then there's a property name, or find one by, and then a property name. However, this grows old very quick, and we need to introduce some custom stuff. So extending this magic repository is really nothing more than inheriting from its methods. In theory, we don't need to do anything. So I've just created a post repository file in the post repository directory, and I'm just going to copy a little bit of the standard code across here. So we obviously start off with our PHP, and and we've got our namespace that it's in our repository, that we are using our entity repository, and that it extends the entity repository. We're not going to put any custom methods in there yet, but we will later on. Let's just have it defined. And then the only other part we need is within the entity itself. So this is a post repository. We want to look at our post, and where we've got our entity annotation, within there we've got a definition for repository class, and we are just pointing to the namespace itself. So I'll fix my little typo. So we've got app bundle, repository, post repository. That class we created a moment ago. And now, when it comes to using that in the controller, I'm sure you might have seen this code before. Let's just use it as if it's code. What you will see is different is that here, I'm not typing out the namespace. What I'm doing, and I'm posting this over now, is putting an extra use statement at the top. So we could just go and type in app bundle colon post, but by putting it at the top, we're doing two things. Right. The first is that it makes the code self-documenting by letting us know what external code is being used. Yeah. So in theory, we could have a completely different poster, blah, 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 and then just alias it as post. So, but in doing that, we haven't had to change anything within the code itself. So that's just a little bit about the flexibility there. Similarly, because we are not using it, saying anything about app bundle in the code itself, if we were to actually move it away from app bundle, say I decided to create a bundle which focuses only on the data schema, we could just change that namespace again and it would carry on working. So this is just something that makes our life much easier in the long run. And similarly, if you're like at the moment, I'm showing you it's an Atom, but I normally use like NetBeans or PHP Storm. You could actually just click and like do a control B or something, and it will take you straight to that file. So again, as a developer, you're saving yourself some time. However, this way of getting repositories is not going to lend itself to our arcade service. It means we're either going to have to inject Doctrine as a dependency into it, or do some magic. But what I propose is we create that as a service itself. So this is just the standard Symfony stuff, and I'm gonna copy paste something out and then explain it briefly for you. I think you're familiar with the way to create services. It's really nothing more than the class and then some Symfony configuration. Like I personally have a simple like naming scheme where I start off with the context of the service. So in this case, it's just kind of repository, and then use like a dot, and it's the post repository. Okay. Doctrine repositories, because of how they are created, definition for this is a little bit different. You can see that we are using, even though we've got it pointing to the right class, it is actually got this factory definition. So this is, again, to do with a different co-invention, a way of designing services called singletons, where you have a class generator. And here we are using the entity manager static function get repository, but we're saying we want to use app bundle and post. So, but because we are not going to be using this repository from within the container itself, i.e. with the normal this and get, I've marked it as false. And it's recommended that we all, unless we need to, we should always create false services. I can see in this build of Symfony, they've now added a few extra bits of magic at the top, but for ours, we wouldn't have that. So, so that keeps it simple. If we were to be doing it the modern Symfony way, we can use one of the functions called auto wiring, which is built into it. But because we work with Symfony 2 for the moment, I've given the full definition. Okay, so now we're all ready to actually create our facade service. We're just, again, within our app bundle, I'm going to give it quite a specific name, because we might want to have a different service for, you know, creation. This is going to be the post retrieval service, and I'll just again copy a little bit of code out and then explain it. So again, we got our simple service namespace. We are going, I've actually brought in the entity repository. This is because whenever we are, sorry, that's just something. Whenever we're handing the constructor some parameters, we should really typecast it. So if we try and give this service anything which isn't a entity repository, it will complain. Yeah? And at that point, all I'm really doing is just reproducing our find function. So as I mentioned, we could have a lot of code surrounding this. We could also manipulate the post itself, but we are keeping the controller away from the database itself. So where, as I mentioned, we can plug in the event listeners or manipulate in the post, but the biggest benefit is that at this point, we have actually separated our logic. We've got the repository itself, which is where we define the queries, and we've got this facade service, which is sort of some protective middleware between it, and we got the controller, which is only really responsible for driving it. So with our service created, we just need to create a quick definition for it. And again, I'll just because I like to give my services some kind of context. This is just a simple one, but it would normally be that I should really call it retrieval.post. You know, it says a retrieval service, and because of that repository service we created earlier, we are now using it as an argument. Like when you pass services as an argument, we need to have that @ symbol. And at that point, we're ready to, in essence, go from within our controller, if we had some data in it, gets that retrieval service and use its method. Yeah. And we don't have to, we don't have to worry about adding on like post-read counters or anything like that. But what this means, as well as keeping the code neater and allowing each service to focus on one thing and doing it well, because our code is actually so short and isolated, it makes building tests much simpler. Yeah? And how I said that we can do substitutions very simply. But now that our code has become so modular, it allows us to, reuse it and in different ways, in different places, and made that a one-step process. So that's that's really, well, let's say that the way we should be designing our data handling services, and can go more into that. Like here we've got retrieval for posts, then we could have, if we were to think about that on our platform, we would have a service for retrieving our inspections, which which would look at it the way the controller would expect to have stuff, and then it would then reach out into the repositories itself, and within that package service, that's where we could do any of like the logging and this sort of stuff. So much cleaner, much easier to test, much easier to debug, much easier to see where it's going on. Okay, for the last part of the little knowledge sharing part today, I would like to talk about the Doctrine Query Builder. Whereas at the moment, we have a mix, I think I counted, it's either 5 or 6 different ways of handling data from the database. And for anything new we build, which as soon as we start with the normalized schema, we should be using this query builder. So I mentioned briefly earlier that Doctrine itself can have queries defined in 3 different ways. You can the first, the lowest level is native SQL. Then one step above that is something called DQL, which is really the same as SQL, but instead of looking at tables, you use data objects. And then, like at the highest level, we've got this Doctrine Query Builder. And this is really just a way of doing stuff in an OOL fashion. So here in the documentation, there is a simple, like select from where, and then you've got your bound parameters. I mean, this documentation is excellent, so I don't believe I would need to tell you too much about it today, but there's only really one thing I think might confuse people a little bit, and that is when we try to use expressions. I could be completely wrong, but it could be great. So what I will do in our post repository is just paste across, or I can type at speed of light, this what I call like a find by fuzzy content. And the objective of this is really to search within the content and the titles itself. So this is not what I call ideal, it's really just an example of using that. So rather than just returning our normal results, because we're going to be using it in more than one context, we should start by assigning the query builder to a variable. Yeah? And you can see that at that point, rather than carrying on with it, because trying to keep the code pipeline very short, at this point it is going into a return statement where, much like what we see on the documentation itself, it's really a simple from. But for our where, because we want to have sort of some multiple conditions in there, I'll just hit it back again. You can see that now we are actually reusing the query builder, and this important part that you should look at the expressions, and then we've got an or, and then I've just simply got the two, that should be an array, and we've simply got the 2 conditions that are going to be in there, again, living as their own query builder expressions. I only feel the need to say this because compared to just writing out either native SQL or DQL, it's already about OO, object-oriented and design, and might be a little bit confused. It's not that. So this really is very simple. And when it comes to, say, wanting to debug it yourself, if we're at the point where you've got your query, we've got, oh, I'm returning that. You've even got a couple of functions that can return either the raw SQL or the DQL itself. And you can either put that into Workbench and play around with it, or do whatever you like at that point. So that's good timing with it. It's just managed to keep it under the time. So I know I've shot through a lot of this information very quickly. I gave it in this manner, so I hope if there are any questions or issues that we can really just put them out there in our chat channel, and we'll address them. And it was quick because we got a lot to do today, and got someone clawing at my heels even at the moment. So I'll just